The discovery did not come like a sudden explosion. It crept in slowly, like a poison Victor Newman had unknowingly been drinking for weeks. A misplaced file, an unusually timed phone call, a subtle shift in Nikki's behavior, each detail on its own could have been dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that refused to be ignored. And Victor was not a man who ignored patterns. At first, he refused to believe it. Not Nikki. Not the one person who had stood beside him through wars, betrayals, and the endless storms that came with power. But denial only sharpened the edge of suspicion. He began to watch more closely, listening not just to what was said, but to what was withheld. Every silence became louder than any confession. When the truth finally revealed itself, it did not shatter him in the way one might expect. It hardened him. Nikki had aligned herself with Jack Abbott, his oldest rival, a man whose very existence had been defined in opposition to him. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a calculated decision, a strategic move. That realization cut deeper than any emotional wound. Nikki had not acted impulsively. She had chosen this. Victor's anger was not loud. It did not manifest in outbursts or visible rage. It was cold, precise, and terrifyingly controlled. Inside him, however, something far more volatile churned. Years of building an empire, of sacrificing everything to maintain control, suddenly felt fragile. If Nikki could turn against him, what else was slipping through his fingers? He told himself it was about survival. That this was what power demanded. That loyalty, once broken, could never be restored. But beneath those justifications lay something he refused to confront, the fear that he had already lost something he could never regain. Meanwhile, Nikki was not untouched by the weight of her decision. What had begun as a calculated alliance with Jack had evolved into something far more complicated. She had convinced herself that Victor needed to be challenged, that his growing ruthlessness demanded intervention. She had framed it as an act of necessity, even of love in its own distorted form. But the reality of her actions lingered heavily. Each step she took alongside Jack felt like crossing an invisible line she could never return from. She saw the consequences forming even before they fully emerged. Victor was not a man who forgave easily, and certainly not a man who accepted betrayal without retaliation. Jack, on the other hand, approached the situation with a different kind of intensity. For him, this was more than strategy. It was legacy. Every move against Victor was fueled by years of rivalry, resentment, and a desire to finally shift the balance of power. Nikki's involvement gave him an advantage he had never possessed before. Yet even he understood the volatility of the situation. Aligning with Nikki meant stepping into deeply personal territory, where emotions could not be controlled as easily as business deals. The tension escalated quietly but relentlessly. Victor began laying the groundwork for a response that mirrored his state of mind, calculated, ruthless, and irreversible. He didn't lash out immediately. Instead, he constructed a plan that would send a message far beyond words. The staged accident was not impulsive. It was engineered with meticulous precision. Every detail was considered, every variable accounted for. To an outsider, it would appear as nothing more than an unfortunate incident. But to Victor, it was something else entirely. It was a demonstration of power, a warning, and a punishment all at once. When the moment came, it unfolded with brutal efficiency. Metal twisted against metal, glass shattered, and the illusion of control both Nikki and Jack had carefully maintained was violently stripped away. The aftermath was chaos, sirens, confusion, and the unmistakable realization that something far more sinister lay beneath the surface. Victor watched from a distance, unseen, his expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, only a deep, unsettling stillness. He had expected to feel vindicated, to reclaim a sense of control that had been slipping away. Instead, he felt something else entirely, an emptiness that no act of retaliation could fill. Nikki, injured but conscious, found herself confronting a reality she could no longer deny. This was not just a consequence of her choices, it was a reflection of the man she had chosen to stand against. Victor's actions had crossed a line that could never be erased. And yet, a part of her couldn't ignore the role she had played in pushing him there. Jack's perspective was equally fractured. The accident, while not fatal, forced him to re-evaluate everything. He had always understood Victor's capacity for ruthlessness, but experiencing it so directly shifted something within him. This was no longer a battle of strategy or pride. It had become something far more dangerous, a conflict where the cost could no longer be calculated. As the dust settled, the three of them were left in a state of uneasy stillness, each grappling with their own internal turmoil. Victor stood at the center of it all, facing a choice he had not anticipated. Continuing down this path meant embracing a version of himself that even he might not recognize, a man defined entirely by control, devoid of anything resembling vulnerability. Admitting he had gone too far, however, required confronting a truth he had spent his life avoiding, that power had its limits, and that some losses could not be reclaimed through force. His anger remained, but it was no longer as clear-cut as before. It had become tangled with something far more complex, regret, though he would never name it as such. The image of Nikki in the aftermath of the accident lingered in his mind, not as a victim, but as a reminder of what had been broken long before the crash itself. Nikki, in her own quiet reflection, began to question the foundation of her actions. What had started as an attempt to challenge Victor's dominance had spiraled into something destructive. She had underestimated the depth of his response, but more importantly, she had underestimated the cost of her own choices. The alliance with Jack no longer felt like a solution. It felt like a catalyst. Jack, ever the strategist, found himself in unfamiliar territory. The lines between ally and liability had blurred. Nikki's involvement, once an advantage, now carried risks he could not fully control. And Victor's reaction made one thing clear: this conflict was far from over. The aftermath did not bring resolution. It brought escalation. Victor's empire remained intact, but the cracks were undeniable. Nikki's loyalty was no longer something he could rely on, and Jack's presence loomed larger than ever. The question was no longer who would win, but how far each of them was willing to go. And in that question lay the true conflict, not just between them, but within each of them. Because the most dangerous battles were not fought with visible weapons. They were fought in silence, in the choices made when no one was watching, in the moments where pride, anger, and fear collided. Victor had set something in motion that could not easily be undone. Whether he chose to continue or step back, the consequences would follow him. Nikki stood at the edge of a decision that would define her. Torn between the past she could not ignore and the future she was no longer certain she wanted. Jack remained caught between ambition and caution, knowing that one misstep could cost him everything he had fought for. The power struggle had evolved into something far more personal, far more destructive. And as each of them moved forward, one truth became impossible to escape. There was no longer a way out that didn't demand sacrifice.